Hey everybody, welcome back to Conversations by Quest for Truth. And today I'm joined by Pastor Mike Putney, who's been pastor here at Windsor Bible Church for almost 16 years now. So you didn't grow up in the church, did you?
Well, in a way, a little bit, yeah and no. Um, I had some interaction when I was younger in the Methodist church. I got sprinkled, and I actually became a member of a church right before I was a teenager. So I had that interaction with it, but it wasn't like I grew up in a strong Christian family. It wasn't like I was discipled through those years of my life. So kind of yes and no. So I was around it. Actually had two friends that I had in school that were both pastors' sons. And so I was always, even though I may not have been in the church all the time, I was always around Christianity in one form or another. And I had a lot of friends that were Christian. So,
But you yourself weren't at that point.
less. I mean, there was a time there when I was going to church every Sunday for probably a couple of years, but it wasn't. And I would say it wasn't a strong Bible believing church that we were in. So, excuse me. So no. It wasn't like I was in a strong Christian influence, although the influence was around me.
Okay. And then, so you grew up in Iowa, right?
Well, I was born in Iowa, and I lived the first 6 years there, which is where the bulk of my family is from, on both my mother and father's side. And then we moved from Iowa to El Paso, Texas, for about a year and a half, which that was an interesting place to live. But I was still really young. A lot of mountains and deserts, so that was kind of cool. And then we moved to Florida for 4 years after that, which was awesome for me because there was so much fishing and outdoor stuff to do there. And I really loved it there. And then we moved to Illinois, and I lived for 8 years in Illinois, and then I joined the Navy from there. So been kind of, going into the Navy too, been kind of all over and seen a lot of different places and that kind of thing.
So you were in the Navy for
Yeah, I was
20 years?
for 21 years from 1983 to 2004. And that was an interesting period in my life. I did a lot of highs and lows spiritually. And but through all that, God was very faithful in putting the right people in my life. And I eventually started walking with God again and started going to a really good Bible believing church, and that's where I met my wife. And but I was getting towards the end of my naval career, and actually, as I was getting involved in church, I was doing some teaching, and I just felt God's call upon my life. And when I retired, it was then that started going to Bible college at Baptist Bible College, which is now Clark Summit University. And I became a youth pastor, assistant pastor at Putney Baptist Church. And I was there for 4 years while I was going to BBC. Kept on going through seminary, and that's when I came here. I came here because of Pastor Don McCall, who goes to churches and helps them when they're struggling, and sometimes bring an intern along with him, and often that intern will stay and become the pastor of that church, and I did, and we've been here ever since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you said that while you were in the Navy, there were people that God sent into your life at times.
Well, looking back at it now, you don't notice it so much when it's going on, but when you're walking through it. But looking back on it now, I can see throughout my whole life how God was putting people into my life that were directing me to Him. Mm-hmm. And it would take a really long time to go through all that, but there were people that were very significant in that. My sister's in-laws were very significant in that. And I had a relationship with them before my sister got married to their son. And, they were a family that helped our whole family to really get back to going to church in a Bible believing, Bible teaching church. And so that had a huge, excuse me, that had a huge impact in my life. And there were people in the Navy that really kind of helped to push me in that direction as well. But one of the things that I would tell you too is that when I had to transfer and I was going from the USS Enterprise, the aircraft carrier, and I had to go to shore duty, and I wanted to stay in the Norfolk area because that's where all my family was, and I couldn't, and so I had to go to Washington D.C. and I didn't want to, but there was a voice in my head, and I don't know if it was God or my conscience. I tend to think it was God telling me you need to go to Washington D.C., and that's where I really started to really get involved in church and involved in ministry, and I learned from a lot of good people, and that's I think what led me here. The funny thing is once I started feeling called, I never applied to a church to be a pastor, which is kind of a weird deal, I guess. I was asked by the pastor that was at Putney if I would come, and they called us there, voted us in. And then Don McCall asked me to come here, and I was called, and they voted us in. So, it's probably a different experience than a lot of guys have, but I think it shows God's hand in leading us and guiding us here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So you've been here for 16 years.
Yeah. As in May, it'll be 16. Actually, the first time we came was in November of 2007 when the first time we visited. Pastor Don asked me to come. So a long time ago now.
Yeah. So
you weren't that old then.
No, I was only 10 at that point. Yeah. So what's it like from then to now pastoring the church?
Well, it's interesting because I think in some ways, while I was towards the end of my Navy career, I was really pastoring on a ship. I was on the USS Eisenhower when I retired, and people would come in and talk. I kept the Bible on my desk, and I was a chief, so people would come in. And I was over a group of young people, and so people would come in and talk to me about. They knew that I was a Christian, and they'd come in and talk to me about difficulties they were going through in life, and it gave me opportunities to share Christ and why I believe what I believe and how he had guided me in my life. Excuse me. And so that really, I think, got the ball rolling and I was starting to serve in the church. And I told the pastor, I said, actually, it was the pastor's wife that came to me and said, do you think God's leading you into full-time ministry, Mike? And I said, yeah, I do, and which I'd never said before openly. And so it wasn't long after that in Virginia, you have to be licensed to preach. It's actually a law. So I got licensed to preach in that church, and I started preaching every once in a while, and I started learning from that, and that's, when I knew I'm going to have to become more proficient in handling God's word. And that's when my wife was from this area, and she grew up in Tunkhannock, Pennsylvania. And her grandmother had connections to people that were professors at Baptist Bible College. And so that's how that really, those connections, I went and talked to the guy, Rodney Decker, who at the time is now with the Lord, was the Greek professor at Baptist Bible Seminary. And he was the guy that kind of convinced me that this is the place that I should have been going to school. So once all those balls started rolling and God was putting those things in place, it became pretty obvious. And then being, asked if I would be the assistant pastor at Mahupany. So, it's like I said, it's not something that, those things weren't something that I just went after. They happened, and God made them happen. And so it's, looking back on it, you don't think about that at the time, but looking back on it, you see God's faithfulness through it all.
Yeah. So what was that moment like when you, like you said, for the first time you said, yeah, God's calling me? Like, what was... Well,
it was kind of strange because I'd been feeling that way. And, I don't know if you feel right away, should I go and share this with somebody? Or I think I'd probably told Amy at that point, my wife. But it was just, she initiated it, you know. She said, Mike, don't you think that the Lord's calling you into full-time ministry? And I said, yeah. You know, I didn't want to lie to her. So then, you know, then the pastor came and talked to me about it. And so, yeah, but it was interesting in that I didn't initiate it myself. It was something that somebody else initiated.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's one way of looking at it.
So, yeah, so like you said, God was leading you, and you weren't. There were just these doors that opened.
Very obvious, very obvious.
Yeah. It's really, at that point, it's just accepting the call to say, yep.
Yeah, and you know, I was still fairly new in a stronger walk with God. Mm-hmm. And so maybe I didn't know enough to be apprehensive, which I think actually looking back is probably a good thing. Because I was actually, one of the other things that I was considering when I was retiring was becoming a physical therapist. And actually when I felt God's call, I was taking college courses to be a physical therapist. So I think that the way that God worked it, it was good because it didn't allow me to hesitate and think, no, it'd probably be better if I was a physical therapist. But the whole thing that I wanted to do when I got out of the Navy is help people. And God said, well, you're going to help people, but in a different way. Mm-hmm. So that's the feeling I've always had since then anyway. But I really think, Jordan, that if you know, if things hadn't worked the way that they had, that I probably would have pursued something completely different. That if, you know, did God prompt that pastor's wife to ask me that question? I don't know, but she did. And I know that God causes all things to work together for good. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think that definitely was a part of it. And so just, I think it shows, you know, God's faithfulness and his sovereignty through all that. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So you went from preaching a little bit in Virginia, and then you started going to school. Mm-hmm. Did you go right to BBC?
Yeah, as soon as I retired, Joy was born 2 weeks after I retired, and then we moved 2 weeks after that, and I started as the assistant pastor at Putney as soon as we moved to Tunkhannock. So yeah, I went right from the Navy, retiring from the Navy, to, I was actually still getting paid to be in the Navy for a couple of months when I was at Putney. I took what's called terminal leave. So I was still officially, even though I'd retired mm-hmm. and gone through all the ceremonies and everything and all that, I was still officially in the Navy for a couple of months. After I retired, I was still being paid full time. But I was also working as an assistant pastor at Putney. So yeah, it was not a transition that I would recommend to everybody. Retiring from a profession that you've had for a long time and having a child at the same time, having a newborn, and going right to this new calling that we had and buying a new house and all that. Yeah, it's not something that I would say this is this is a good way to do it. But God provided exactly what we needed through all that stuff. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, what was that like, kind of going through that, like, in your spiritual walk with all of that stuff that was going on?
You know, I was still, what I would say, somewhat of I was strong in my faith, but I was still somewhat new to that strength. And so, I don't know, you know, I think there was so much going on, it didn't give me time to question a whole lot or doubt a whole lot, especially being a new father at the same time. You know, you're so busy with that new child and you're up at night and all that kind of stuff with your baby. And so I think that all those things working together, and I was always a very active person when I was in the military, so I had so many things to consider at that point that I just did them. You know what I mean? I didn't dwell upon them too much. You know, I was trying to learn as much as I could, obviously, from the pastor at Putney and from my courses and the professors at BBC at the same time. So to to put a lot of apprehension in there, there wasn't, because I had so much that was kind of inundating me at the time, that it didn't give me a lot of time to really think about doubts or apprehension or anything. So it was an exciting time, but there definitely was a lot going on, that's for sure.
Yeah. Was there a time when there were some doubts later on?
No, not that I can, I can't think of any. I've heard pastors talk about, once they got in, that they had doubts, and even guys that have been in for a while. But I can honestly say that I've never had any apprehension. Like I said, God opened so many doors and made it so obvious that I think it would be a lack of faith then to have apprehension and to not see that, because it was so obvious. So, no, I really haven't had any doubts. There's been times where I've doubted decisions that I've made as a pastor, or maybe we shouldn't have gone this way. And there, I think any pastor would tell you that they do make mistakes. And so, but making mistakes also, I think, helps you to start to develop wisdom. You think about, okay, why did I do this? What could I have done better? Did I not rely enough on God through this, or whatever the situation is? So, there's apprehension to choices that you've made in ministry, I think, sometimes, that makes you think more as you get wiser as you go through ministry and you're growing in your faith. It helps you then, I think, later to make wiser decisions. And so there's been those, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you never made a mistake, you'd never learn anything.
I think it'd puff you up a little bit too,
Yeah.
and you would fall quickly, if you didn't learn from those mistakes and think you never made any.
So how long were you at Mahoopany?
4 years.
4 years.
4 years, yeah. And that was kind of a decision that we had made beforehand, that I knew that God wasn't calling me, and I don't know if, I didn't feel called to be an assistant/youth pastor. I was already, as soon as I started, I was 40 years old, which isn't, now that I look back at it, it's not that old. But I thought so at the time. I didn't think it was ancient or anything, but I thought it was kind of older to be a youth pastor. But I didn't think that was really that wasn't the feeling I got, why God was bringing me into the ministry. The opportunity at Mahoopany, Amy grew up in that church, and so we got married in that church, and so we knew the people. Now, the pastor that was there that was new. He'd only been there maybe a year when we got there. But we knew a lot of the people. Excuse me, probably should have brought a ring. But Amy grew up with a lot of those people. And I had known them for several years. And so one of the things that I would say is that it was, in some ways, it was very much of a pastoral ministry. And what I learned through the time, like having not just a youth pastor ministry, but a pastoral ministry, and it was a large youth group. And there were times where we had up to around 75 kids in the youth group. But I really became not just their pastor, the teens pastor, but the pastor of their parents. And I spent as much time with them doing things, and a lot of those parents got involved with the youth group. And so we very much, Amy and I, ministered to them as much as we did to the teens. But I knew, and Amy and I both knew that, especially I think with my age, that we were going to have to transition from that into something different. And I also felt that God had called me to preach, which you do have the opportunity to do that as an assistant, but not week to week. And that's where you really learn about teaching God's word. Not just in going to classes and things like that and studying the word for yourself, but you have to get up there and speak and learn from that experience. And so that, having that experience and coming here has really helped me to grow in my teaching ministry. But I've always felt that I wanted to be a teacher more than, a shepherd teacher. And so, that's where God is really growing me here, is I think in that capacity. So when I first came here, I had a lot to learn, obviously. And I still have a lot to learn. I don't want to think that I don't. every day there's something that you learn from. But God has really used my time here to grow me in that capacity, and He's brought so many more people into my life that have helped me in that. And so that's become obvious too, that's where God wanted us to serve. And even going, taking the classes that I'm taking now, I was in Clark Summit yesterday talking to my advisor and just talking to him about the things that I was. It's just really neat. And, and I wouldn't have had those experiences had God not brought us here. And so I'm very thankful for that.
So you were there for 4 years, and then that was when you were going to school too, right? So.
Yeah, going to school full time, and Faith was born a year before we came here. So yeah, I had a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old and a newborn my last year at Putney, and I was going to school full time. I used to go down from Putney, we lived in Tunkhannock, we were right next to each other, and I was going to Clark Summit every day. And when I was taking seminary classes, I took what they call dual classes, where I was taking college classes and seminary classes at the same time. And Greek started at 7:30. So I was leaving like at 5:30 or maybe 6 to get there on time. And so then I was in school all day, and then I would come from school and I would spend like an hour or two at home, and I would do some studying. And then if we had a ministry going on at church, then I would go to that ministry and then come home. And it was neat at the time though too, because Amy's mom and dad are from there. And so, having the youth group, we were able to, Amy's mom was babysitting all the time if we had an activity with the youth group or something. And we did at least 2 activities every month with the youth group. And so that was helpful with 2 newborns. Instead of dragging them all around with us, Amy's mom and dad were able to babysit them. And so yeah, like I said, God made everything happen exactly the way that it was supposed to, and it was just easy to see His faithfulness through all that.
So you said you felt like you were more like called to be like a pastor, a teaching pastor, but while you were in like the assistant youth pastor, did you feel like you were out of place?
No, there were times because of my age where, I could have been the dad of, it was a different generation. Obviously I grew up in the 70s and early 80s. And, so it was a different generation. And even now though, those guys are like my kids. I still interact with a lot of the youth group. Matter of fact, one of them is a pastor now, and I see him fairly frequently. And he went to BBC after I did, and now he has a child. And so I still interact with a lot of the not obviously as much as I used to, but I still catch up with them and still get a phone call or a Facebook message or whatever every once in a while from one of them. And so that never goes away. You never, when you become somebody's pastor, you always are, even when you're not. Like Pastor Don said, he still prays for me, but that's true. So, those were the people, the teens and their parents, those were the people that I pastored for that time. And I was teaching, it just wasn't from the pulpit in front of the whole church. I was teaching those young people, and I was hopefully teaching their parents as well and helping them to grow. But I just knew that it was, that this was, and that's when Pastor Don came into my life. And I had this opportunity, and I think Pastor Don is a very godly man, excuse me, very Christ-like. And I had this opportunity to learn under his tutelage. And I thought, well, God has brought this opportunity into my life for a reason as well. And that's when we made that transition to come here. And so I got to learn, in a classroom. I got to learn from a pastor at Putney, the pastor of the church where I started preaching. And I got to learn from Pastor Don here. So I got a lot of not just classroom experience, but practical experience at the same time, which a lot of guys don't have when they start. But that was obvious that God was making that happen too, and opening all those doors. And like I said, it happened. And so you kind of just react to if you see that door open and you think that God is opening that door, then you need to walk through it. And so at the time when we made that transition from Putney to here, we believed that God had opened that door, and we felt that we needed to walk through it. So that really was more than anything. It wasn't just that, well, I'm not supposed to be, okay, I'm a youth pastor now, but I'm not supposed to. It wasn't so much that feeling. It was that we just had this feeling as I was going through that experience of getting to know Pastor Don and being in classes with him, but becoming his friend, and then spending time with him, and then him asking us to come here. You could tell that that door was open, and that was the opportunity that God wanted for us at that time. So we just felt that we had to be faithful to that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So how long did you know Pastor Don before he suggested that you come here?
About 3 years, I would suppose. Well, it was my senior year there in college, and so I had known him close to 4 years at that point. So yeah, 20 now. So because it was 20 years ago that I retired and started going to college. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you knew it. Did you know him pretty well, like your relationship?
Well, yeah. Here's the kind of the interesting thing, I think, is that I'll never forget my first day. You know, I had been in the Navy 21 years, and then my first day of college at BBC, Clark Summit University now, my first day there, you know, when you're a married student, you live off campus and all that, and so you don't get all the memos, at least you didn't back then, and internet was around, obviously, but, you know, you didn't get all the memos and everything. Well, the first day back then, you were supposed to wear a tie. I didn't wear a tie. I had like on, you know, khaki pants and a button-down shirt, I think. Mm-hmm. So, but it was in one of my classes, and I think it was Western Civilization with Miss Cagley, that you had to do this project at the end of the semester, a big project, but you had to have a partner or partners. Well, I didn't know any of these young college kids. You know, I'm 40 years old. They're 18, 20, 21, whatever. And I didn't know any of them. I'm going to do well, at the end of the class, two older guys came up to me, and they also weren't wearing ties because they lived off campus and they were married and they were around my age. And they said, "Do you want to do your project with us?" And I became really good friends with them. And we also became students of Pastor Don together. And he really took a shine to us, I think, because we were older. And, you know, he's a little bit older than us, but not a whole lot. So we became friends, and we had this wonderful fellowship there was another couple of older students as well, but we had this wonderful fellowship with him. And that's really where that came from. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you had that small group of people kind of your age, but
yeah,
it's still that weird situation.
And it was weird because we were closer to the professors' ages than we were the other students' ages. So we became pretty good friends with a lot of the pastors that were there. Or professors that were there, and a lot of them were pastors too. But the neat thing is that is, especially when you're in seminary, they would have several of the professors had all their students over to their houses, and they would have meals with them and all that. And the faculty there is always praying for all the students and developing relationships with them. And I think if you really, the classroom stuff is, necessary, obviously, but more than the classroom stuff, what they taught us was about developing, relationships. Mm-hmm. That is a big part of what you're going to be doing in ministry. Whatever kind of ministry it is, whether it's pastoral or otherwise, that it's all about developing relationships, and they exemplified that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and so we became close to Pastor Don, and that relationship developed. And said hi to him yesterday. I didn't have time to eat lunch with him yesterday, but I stopped by his office and said hi. And he was on a conference call with somebody else, but still said hey. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely good to have those people that can, come alongside you, and, like you've known them for 20 years and you still talk with them.
Yeah.
So moving from there on to kind of coming here, what did you know anything about Windsor Bible Church before?
Well, Pastor Donna told me quite a bit because he had been here for a while.
Right.
And so actually, Pastor Don, when he comes to a church, he does surveys, and church health surveys. And he had done a church health survey here. And I was actually taking a class with him at the time. He used to show the surveys from different churches that he'd been at and what the initial surveys showed as far as how the church saw their own spiritual health. And not Mahoopany, but Windsor had the lowest score of any of the churches that he had ever been at. And so when I knew that I was going to be coming here, some of the other guys in the classes were like, "Are you sure you want to go there?" and that kind of thing. And here's the way I look at it is, well, obviously they need to have a pastor, and they need to have somebody that's going to be there and be faithful. And those scores changed around fairly quickly, and we still do them. It's been since COVID the last time that we've done one, but they've gone up every year, and I think there was never a bigger change in any church that Pastor Don had been at and had been here. But that didn't occur until after he left, which is not saying anything bad about him. But no, matter of fact, that was kind of an interesting deal, because I didn't know that he had planned on moving on, and we had been here about 9 months. I was here 9 months as his intern. We were living in the parsonage, and the annual business meeting was coming up. And we had, one of the things that we were tasked with doing was making changes to the Constitution. So it was going to be kind of an interesting annual business meeting. And because there were a lot of things that had to be voted on, every one of those 27 changes had to be voted on individually. And so that was going to take a lot of conversation and a lot of walking through. And at the time, there were a few people that were known as being kind of argumentative. And so, I'm thinking, well, this is going to be a doozy of a business meeting. And at one of the deacons meetings, he said, "I'm not going to be there for the annual business meeting. It's time for me to move on. And so you'll have to also, one of the things you'll have to vote on is whether you want to keep Mike as a pastor or not." So yeah, at the same time where all these changes were being made, Pastor Don obviously thought it was the right time for him to leave, or he wouldn't have done that. But it was kind of a shock to me when he said that, because I think the annual business meeting was like a month away. And so, I was like, oh, so I was going to have to lead the annual business meeting while it was also being voted on whether I was going to stay as a pastor or not. So yeah, that was an interesting deal.
Yeah. So at that point though, was it that you trusted him enough to know that if he thinks it, then...
Yeah, and he and I talked about it too, it was, he wouldn't have felt that he was supposed to be moving on unless he thought we were ready to, to be a pastor and a wife here and excuse me, at that time. So, yeah, but when he first said that at Deacon's meeting, it was like, what? But then he and I talked about it afterwards, and I trusted him enough to know that he would, he wouldn't make that kind of decision unless he felt it was the right decision. So.
Yeah. So then they voted, obviously, to keep you around.
Yeah, pretty much unanimous, I think. I think maybe one no vote. So, that wasn't too bad. And the church had gone through some difficult times. And so, and I think the church had been not hurt necessarily by the pastors that had been here, but just in the length of time. The two pastors prior had only been here a short period of time, which doesn't mean that was wrong or anything. I don't think it was. But I think that when you go through a couple of pastors in a relatively short period of time, the church can start having some doubts about itself as a church. Why are pastors not staying very long here? And I think there were some issues in the church. Obviously, that's why Pastor Don was here, and those issues had to be worked through. But I think the church had some doubts about what are we doing? Should we keep on going? Should, and so, Pastor Don is a really good guy to kind of, in Navy terms, set the course right and get you running in an even keel. And so he was able to do that. And I was able to see what he did, for those 9 months. So I learned a whole lot from that. And the neat thing about that was those 9 months is that Amy and I got to really know the people of this church. So when they voted on us, it wasn't like they had called us and I'd preached a few times and given my testimony. Mm-hmm. The church knew us as a family. We lived in the parsonage for 9 months. So they knew us as a family when they voted us in. I, to be honest with you, Jordan, I think it's a really good way for a church to call a pastor. And I know that's not practical in every case, but if you can get to know a pastor and his family before you call them, I think that's the best of all possible worlds in that kind of situation.
Yeah, definitely. So, starting off as pastor here 16 years ago, almost, where were you at spiritually when you started, and how is that kind of?
Well, I wasn't at the same place I am now. Mm-hmm. I think because so much had been thrown on me in a short period of time, that I was still really thinking through. I knew what I believed. I got ordained, and there were professors and there were other pastors that were part of my ordination council, and so, and I had been when I didn't get my master's until 2015, but even when I graduated from BBC, they basically make you do an ordination council before you graduate. So you walk through all the different areas of theology, and you have to be sound in that, or they won't let you graduate. So I knew the basics of theology, and I was functional in them. But I still had a whole lot to learn, as any pastor does. And even now, having had even more education and everything, I still have a whole lot to learn. We all do until we see Christ face to face. But it's understanding that, and I think it's okay. Even if you call a pastor and he's relatively young, it's okay to do that if that pastor is committed to keep on learning, and the church is committed to being there with him in that they need to understand that the pastor also has to grow, that a pastor isn't perfect when he starts any ministry. And so, I had a lot of growth to do, and thankfully the church has been very patient with me through that. Sometimes I don't know if that happens in every church. I think sometimes there are so many expectations thrown on a pastor and his family that are unreal expectations. And I think it's a good thing if a prospective pastor in a church walk through those expectations before there's any call made to that prospective pastor. I think that's a really good thing. That what are the expectations? And I think the prospective pastor should share with them where he is at the time, which I did with the church. The church knew exactly where I was, I think, because I had shared my testimony and I'd shared where I was in my education. They got to know us as people for 9 months. So that was really helpful there. But obviously I still had a lot to learn. I was growing. And I've learned a whole lot more since then. I've become more, I don't know what the right word here is, more, I don't want to seem cocky, but I've become more confident in what I believe in. And I understand at a deeper level why I understand why I believe in what I do. And I think that's important as you grow as a pastor to help your congregation understand, help your flock understand that you are growing and you're becoming more proficient, more knowledgeable. I think any church should want that in any pastor. And I think that sometimes pastors can get stuck in a rut where they're not growing so much because the expectations can be so high and there can be so much to do and you're dealing with so many different people. But you have to be committed, I think, to even going through all that stuff. I have to keep on growing. I have to keep on learning. I have to keep on. Some of that comes from being with your people. You learn from them. You learn about them. You learn how to minister to them. But there's a part where you have to be in the Word and you have to keep on. You have to be challenged by other people that know more than you do, and that never goes away. And I think that desire, I think if you're truly called, Jordan, that desire is always there and never goes away until the time that you're no longer a pastor. And maybe it keeps on going after that too. But, I think especially for a pastoral calling, that you always have a deep desire to learn God's word and to become more proficient in it. And that's one of the qualifications that a man be apt to teach, an elder be apt to teach. So, you start off at a level, wherever you are at that point, but hopefully you have within you that God-given desire to continue to grow in knowing him more and more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and have those people that are still walking beside you.
Yep.
Even
with you.
Right.
With you. Yeah, I think if you're walking with them as you're growing, they see that. I would think, I haven't asked anybody, I guess, but I would think they've seen a difference between Pastor Mike 2008 and Pastor Mike 2024. And I hope the difference is better. I hope they've seen some growth and experienced that as well. So, yeah.
So, it's kind of weird at this point because, you've been here 16 years and obviously a lot has changed, but you've kind of been, been the pastor here. So it's kind of hard to talk about that because it's like, well, you've been pastor. It's not like, oh, well, this thing,
Well,
but,
yeah, the church is always changing because it's organic. It's an organism. It's a living body. And, there's been a lot of people that I pastored and they're not here anymore. And for different reasons, some of those reasons is they're home with the Lord. Some of those reasons are they moved. Some of those reasons are for whatever reason they didn't think this was the right church for them to be at. And I respect those kinds of decisions. People need to be where they think God wants them to be. But I also think once you make a decision to become a member of a church, that you should be faithful to that decision. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And understand that you are going to go through difficulties in that body. That it's not just, God does, and I don't think God wants it to be easy for us. He wants us to learn from the difficulties, and even relational difficulties, which you're going to have in a church. If you become close, you rub together, and sometimes we rub ourselves the wrong way. And that's going to happen. There's going to be friction, and there are going to be some of those relational things like that. But what you hope you see is that members in your church start to become spiritually mature enough to work through those things and to learn from those things and to be humble enough to say, it doesn't have to be my way. And I think even as a pastor, you realize it doesn't have to be my way. I don't want it to be my way. We were in 1 Peter, not lording your authority over others, guiding them. It's what you do with a flock, and that's, Peter's talking about shepherding God's flock there, and you guide them and you direct them and bring them to a place where they can grow closer to Christ so they can make Christ-like decisions. And so, change is going to happen in a church. Matter of fact, one of our previous members was here talking to me this morning right before you came in, Ray Kopp. And, they had to move, and Ray and his wife Pat have been faithful members here for a long time and led the Celebrate Ministry Recovery. And, that was a neat experience. But, they were in a life situation where they had to move. And they're actually going to Bridgewater in Montrose now. And we talked about that this morning. I was really glad they made that decision because I think that's a pretty good biblical church, Bible teaching church, and a church that's on fire. And so that was neat to see. And you're going to have those changes within a church. There are people, even in the last few months, new people that have been coming. And so getting to know them and developing relationships with them, that never goes away. You're always having to grow in your relationships with the people that you know and the people that start coming to your church for whatever reason. Now you start that process over again of getting to know them and developing relationships. And even when people leave, that doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship with them ends and your spiritual impact on their lives ends there. There's a number of people that have left our church and are going to different churches that I still talk to, sometimes on a weekly basis. or things like that. And you know, I think for me, Jordan, what I try to do is just to be the best friend I can be, to be there for people, to hopefully make an impact in their lives for Christ. And I think that's all you can do. And sometimes that's going to change. But the church that we are right now, 6 months from now, it'll look a little different. And a year from now, it'll look a little bit more different than that, and on and on. And so you expect the church to change. And what you hope is happening is that as you change and become more like Christ and grow closer to Him, is that you're helping and leading your church into that same kind of change. And that's the change that you're looking for. I think that we are a more Christ-like church than we were in 2008. I think. Someday I'll have to talk to God about that. I have that accountability, but I think we are. And I think the church health surveys have kind of helped us to see that, borne that out as well. So yeah, and I don't worry about the size of our church. Obviously, you have to have a certain size to keep on going, but I don't worry about having huge numbers. The growth, here's what I think, and this is my own philosophy, is that if you help people to grow in their relationship with Christ, then that growth goes outward, and that brings more people in. That seeds are being planted as they become more like Christ, and that helps your church to grow. And I think God blesses that too, that He'll direct people here if we're heading in the right direction. So that's my main concern. I think that if you take care of the important things, the other things like numerical growth, those will take care of themselves. And so you shouldn't be sweating the small, when they call it sweating the small stuff. And not that that's small, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the spiritual growth of each member of this church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things with a lot of pastors of small or churches deal with is they kind of tend to take more things and kind of have a higher load instead of delegating and that kind of thing. So has that been a struggle through the years?
Maybe at times, probably, that I do things that I don't necessarily have to do, and then probably things I could give to other people and delegate. I think I've gotten better at that over time. One of the things I had to do when I was in the Navy is delegate. Mm-hmm. So I understand how to do it. There are things, here's what I would say, and I don't know if this is right or not. There are things that I like to do behind the scenes that people might not necessarily expect a pastor to do. Mm-hmm. And I don't share what those things are a lot of times, what I'm doing, because I like to keep those kind of to myself and with God. But yeah, I think that I balance it out well. I think I've gotten to a point where I'm wise enough now to, if I need to hand something off, and it's too much. There was a situation last year where I was going to pick someone up who's a member of our church, and they don't have a vehicle and they can't drive. And so every Sunday I was going to pick them up before church, so I'd have to leave early, drive to get them, and then bring them into church. And I got to the point where I'm like, this is too much with all the other stuff that I have to do on a Sunday morning to go and get this person. So I talked to the deacons about it, and they said, hey, well, so every deacon, now I only have to do it once a month, which is a huge relief, and it gives me more time in the morning to do things here at church when I need to. And so, but I had to get to the point where I'm like, man, so hopefully I've become more wise about it. And what was really neat though was that the deacons weren't hesitant to say, no, we're going to help you with this. We'll do this. And the neat thing about it is now they're getting to share in that ministry. And I think it's actually a really good ministry. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
So another aspect is kind of managing your work with your family life and that kind of thing. So has that been a struggle, and how do you?
I don't think so. There's going to be times where it will be. There's going to be times where things come up in the church that are going to require your undivided attention at that time. But I would say most of the time that's not the case. This is my own personal conviction. You know, to be a pastor, according to 1 Timothy 3, you have to lead your own family well. So to me, before you can do this, you have to be a good husband, you have to be a good father. And that doesn't go away, because if it does, to me, then you lose your qualification to be a pastor. So to me, it's a little, and I might be wrong about this, but to me, it's a little bit more important than actually pastoring. If I get that wrong, then I can't be a pastor. So I have to get that right in order just to be qualified to be a pastor. So I need to be there for my family, which sometimes when you have I only have one teenage daughter at home now, one in the Navy, obviously, but even my remaining teenage daughter, she keeps me on my toes. She's involved in a lot of stuff, and I need to be there for her in those things. I need to be there for my wife. She's a busy lady teaching in Binghamton, a lot of things going on there. And so I got to be there for them. If I can't be there for them, if I can't pastor my own family, if I can't lead my own family, then you can't lead a church. That's why that's a qualification. So yeah, you have to manage that well. And if you're not, then you need to rethink that.
Yeah, so I think that kind of wraps it up pretty well. Just in closing, what's a piece of advice that we can give to people to help them grow spiritually?
Be committed to your relationship with Christ first and foremost. I mean, that we talked about relationships, and that's what a church is about. But if your relationship with Christ isn't strong, you can't be a pastor. And sometimes I've seen, being around younger guys, attached to the college and stuff, the university, you see guys and you realize that they're not ready to be a pastor. Maybe they will be someday. Maybe this is part of God getting them ready. But they're not close to Christ. And you can't, the other thing I would say is, if you're not close to Christ, you can't be a good dad, you can't be a good husband, you can't be a good discipler, So that's the key thing, is be close to Christ. Don't just study to become more knowledgeable. Study the Word of God. Pray so that you get to know Him more and you understand what His purposes are, not just in what He's doing in creation, but what He's doing in your life. And, as you get to know Him more, then you become the person that you were always supposed to be. What I've learned is that's an awesome person. That's a person that God created to be a certain way and a certain kind of person. And when you start becoming that, that's a neat thing. So that's the best advice I think I can give anybody, is to grow closer to Jesus Christ.
Thank you. All right. And thank you for coming on.
Anytime.
And we'll see you again next time.
All right.